Good afternoon. Welcome to today's featured HNLA member webinar, Data Privacy and Cybersecurity and How It Impacts Your Business, presented by HNLA Silver partner Deloitte. My name is Lauren Pravlik. I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Business Development here at HNLA. As a partner of HNLA, Deloitte supports our industry's growth and efficacy. We are thrilled to have members of their team join us today. As many of you might be aware, Deloitte provides audit, tax, risk, and financial advisory and consulting services. They're continuously evolving how they work and how they look at marketplace challenges so they can continue to deliver measurable, sustainable results for their clients and communities. Today, Deloitte experts will discuss the impacts data privacy laws and the threats of cybersecurity can have on your business and where the hotel industry can work to safeguard themselves. Before I turn today's presentation over to the experts, just a few housekeeping remarks. Today's webinar will be recorded and available for playback at a later date via the HNLA webinar archive. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to enter them into the Q&A or chat features of the Zoom platform. Our speakers will address questions at the end. Our speakers today will be introduced by Guy Langford. Guy is a partner in the Deloitte Risk and Financial Advisory practice within Deloitte & Touche, and the former U.S. leader of the transportation, hospitality, and services industry. In his roles, Guy leads many relationships in the hospitality sector as either lead relationship or advisory partner. He regularly exchanges and discusses emerging issues with client service teams serving our industry. Guy has deep experience advising financial sponsors and corporate clients on M&A transactions, providing buy and sell side due diligence, accounting structuring, financial and operating aspects of transactions, and integration activities. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Guy.
Thanks so much, Lauren, and good afternoon or good morning, depending on which coast folks are on. Appreciate the introduction and the kind words, Lauren. One thing I would say is we truly value our partnership with AHLA and really look forward to sharing this topic with you today. As you kind of mentioned, I spent a lot of my time in the transportation, hospitality, and lodging industry, and increasingly we spend more time with our clients trying to help them navigate an increasingly complex world where cyber really touches all facets of the business. It's not just finance, it's not loyalty, it's not operations, sales. It really covers many facets of the hospitality and lodging ecosystem. And data privacy is right there as well. So what we wanted to do is share with you a couple of the current considerations around that. And I have two esteemed colleagues to do that with me today. Dan Sutter, Senior Manager in our Deloitte Risk and Financial Advisory Cyber Risk Service practice. He's been with us for more than 15 years. I've worked closely with Dan on a number of opportunities and client challenges in the sector. You've got the bios in front of you, so I'm not going to read them out verbatim, but Dan has worked across a number of sectors and specifically around the China cybersecurity and related regulations, EU, GDPR, Brazil, LGPD, and also the California Consumer Privacy Act. Along with Dan, we've got Johnny Yu, who is a managing director in our risk and financial advisory practice. I've worked one-on-one with Johnny on a number of client mandates recently. He's got more than 25 years of experience. And Johnny and I recently have been doing a little bit more work around GDPR and CPCS, or China cybersecurity. And Johnny will share with you a little bit more information around that as it relates to all participants who are doing business in China, including hospitality providers. So with that, I'm going to hand the microphone to Dan. Thanks for being with us today.
Thanks, guys. So we can actually jump on to the next slide. So the next slide is coming up. So first off, thanks everybody for having me here today. The main purpose I'm here to talk about is something called CCPA, California Consumer Privacy Act. As a quick expansion of my background, all I do for a living is privacy. It's all I've been doing for about 16 years is privacy. So I appreciate any opportunities to talk about where we see the privacy space going and so on. So I'm going to try to do two different things within the scope of these slides. For those that don't know what CCPA is, I'll try to give you just enough information that you're good and dangerous on the topic. For those that are aware of the CCPA, there's a secondary section we've included that starts talking about the impact of the recent amendments, as well as what we're seeing from other states. So I'm going to try to check two different boxes as we go through this content. So the first thing we wanted to call up is kind of a bit of the origin story for the CCPA and so on. California historically is considered to be one of the most litigious states in the United States. You know, they have a number of privacy-centric related regulations that were already in place prior to the CCPA. So the fact that the CCPA and all of its onerous requirements came out of California really was no surprise. If people had to take a bet on this, the betting odds in Vegas would be on California to be the first state to kick out similar legislation. So what we want to include here is just a sampling of some of those regulations. Obviously, there's tons of other regulations in the space surrounding privacy and data protection in California, but these are some of the bigger pieces that frankly are a bit of inputs to CCPA. Next slide, we'll go into what CCPA is. So what we like to do when we start talking about CCPA is kind of talk a little bit about how it started, what it means for you, where do we see those overall risks, both financial and unexpectedly operationally impacting the business. So the first thing is, why did the CCPA start? The long and short of it is individuals started getting very concerned, specifically one individual, started getting very concerned that they found that their information was being processed and used and collected in ways that they were not anticipating. So again, looking at a lot of the big technology players in Silicon Valley, for instance, there was a lot of data collection activities, a lot of usage, a lot of sharing that simply just didn't sound right. Again, I won't call out specific organizations, but you may use a particular search engine just to look up a particular recipe. That the idea that your recipe-related search is then applied to you in a deep profile, and then the analytics are run against that, and then your related preferences are then mined against you and sold to other companies is not something you would readily expect when you just looked up that simple recipe on your particular search engine. So that irked this one particular individual. What's good is this one particular individual had some money behind him and had a good network. So it really started a true grassroots effort. What then happened was a large set of requirements were pushed out. There was an amendment that was placed on the ballot for individual California residents to ultimately vote on. And because of how onerous those requirements were going to be tied to the ballot provision, there was a bit of an about face, and the CCPA was readily signed into law before the ballot provision could go through, because frankly, the requirements of the ballot provision were way more onerous than the actual CCPA language. So let's talk about what the CCPA actually is. So the very first thing is about applicability. So again, this is focused on California residents. California residency is widely confusing. While they've said, listen, this applies to California residents, where that kind of starts and stops isn't terribly clear. They have defined that there are certain individuals like myself, I'm in California most weeks, but I don't live there. So they have included stuff surrounding California transitory residents, and individuals like me would be excluded from the law. So it focuses on California residents, and it focuses on personal information. And personal information itself is a very broad definition. In that, I'll use an example. If using a hotel, the type of alcohol I would prefer at the bar is considered a bit of personal information and tied to me and is in scope. So it's not just what we've been used to over the past few years, where it's an email address and other PII. It really is preferences. It's very kind of almost semi-anonymous bits of information about you are really the scope of this regulation. So it's written extremely broad. That's the first part. What this ends up happening within the regulation is there's two big impacting things, which we'll get into, is giving individuals access and transparency into what data is being collected and how it's being used. So that's one of the first things that it's called out, is that, hey, listen, if we want to find out how my data is being used, we need to find out and provide a mechanism for an individual to reach into those companies and get the information and so on. Secondarily to that, it's people want to say, okay, based on that recipe I just looked up, I don't want that information shared. And that was the other piece that this regulation was aiming to call out, was providing that transparency and providing new mechanisms to be able to take action on that data, because that data has value to you. and that data has value to other companies, but it's still your data. You should be able to do something with it. Pivoting over to does it apply? For the most part, this applies to most organizations operating in California. So there's going to be a lot of smaller mom and pop shops that this won't apply to, but for the most part, if you have significant operations, you're a multinational operating in the United States, this is going to apply to you. At least as far as the scope of clients that Deloitte works with, this pretty much applies to every single one of our clients that is considered for-profit. This does not apply to not-for-profit and nonprofit organizations. So again, you are for-profit, you're operating in California, and you're doing legitimate business there of significant volumes, this regulation is going to apply. Pivoting over to the last part about the potential impacts. The regulation itself calls out some monetary impacts, but frankly, that's not the difficult part. So as you noted here over on the right, it's $7,500 per intentional violation. So again, if you breach information and don't take readily available action to then remediate that issue, there's a per record type fine that can be applied. Same thing that there is a class action capability. So me and 10,000 of my friends can join together and enact class action status against an organization that is deemed to have mishandled my information and breached my information and so on. Frankly, those are the easier things to quantify. What we found, and I'll talk about it more in other slides, is that there's a number of other avenues that individuals can take to kind of like twist the knob and kind of like twist the knife in organizations that they feel are mishandling their information outside of bringing them to court or imposing some kind of fine and working with the California AG. Last thing I want to note here is probably one of the more confusing parts of the regulation. So this regulation is enforced went into effect as of January 1st of this year. The California AG is not enforcing it until July 1st of this year. There's a lot of organizations that I've worked with that misinterpreted that and thought they didn't have to comply until July 1st. No, you have to comply as of January 1st of this year. Next in July, this coming July, that's when the California AG will start taking action, and we do think they will absolutely start taking action. Next slide. So I'm going to move through these fairly quick. So again, what do we know about this regulation? So CCPA itself, there was another regulation prior to this called the EU GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. That was a significant regulation, still is. California Consumer Privacy Act mirrors a lot of those components. We learned in the GDPR that in order to align an organization to the requirements of that regulation, it took a village. This was not something where a bunch of smart lawyers can get into a room and write policies. That happened with GDPR, and that's happening so far with CCPA. You cannot lawyer your way out of your obligations. A strong privacy policy does not mean you suddenly comply with this regulation. This requires involvement with IT, procurement, legal, compliance, business operations, you name it, IT, information security, all of these teams need to be involved in order to ultimately comply with the requirements. Next slide. So I'm going to blow through these fairly quickly. So we have a couple slides in here that just talk about ultimately CCPA in a nutshell. So we try to compress this entire regulation into 2 slides. So I'll move through it fairly quickly as I hit some of these pieces. So I mentioned before, it's an extremely broad definition. It says personal information. It's extremely broad. It can be like, again, the alcohol preferences at the bar. If the hotel is collecting that information and storing it and tying it to me, then that's considered personal information. If, for instance, you're not sure if it's me or, say, my wife making that purchase, that's still protected because that's considered part of my household. So it's a broader definition. So it's not just, okay, we can tie it to Dan Sutter with this particular pulse. We'd say this is a meal purchase preference based on some member of my household. So again, the fact that you can't say it's definitely Dan Sutter or my wife, it doesn't matter. Householding still applies. Moving further down, as I talked before, the regulation allows for transparency into your data. So an individual can raise their hand and say, give me the information you have about me, hotel, and you have 45 days to do it. At the same time, a person can raise their hand and say, hey, delete the information you have about me. And I'm oversimplifying, but you ultimately do have to delete the information or take ways to obfuscate the data that you no longer know it's tied to, for instance, Dan Sutter. The additional part to that is now if you have not done it yourself, look through a number of websites, the Amazons and all these other websites, and you're going to start seeing a link in the bottom of the page to say, do not sell my personal information. Those links are supposed to be on websites that are complying with the CCPA, and that allows a facility for a person to click on that link, provide some basic information, and stop that organization from selling that data to other third parties. Yeah, fairly straightforward ask. If you have not done it, feel free to go to websites, click on that link. If you don't see that link in that website and it's a for-profit organization, that might be a problem. So again, it's a facility that is providing ability for individuals to say, stop moving my data, stop making money off of my data. I'll move through things fairly quickly. So again, there's a specific opt-in consent is necessary to sell information of minors. So the regulation itself just helps specify what is in place, where if the person's under 16, under 13, what do we have to do for the data in order to use it appropriately? Last piece to highlight in here is this discrimination. So if a person says, delete my information, that also means then you cannot then offer that person diminished support, diminished services just because they wanted to access and take action on their data. There's a lot of nuances to that. There's a lot of ways to accomplish that. I won't go into all of it for the sake of this conversation, but ultimately you can't discriminate against a person that has said, you know, give me access to my data and so on. Next slide. I'm going to move through this very quick. So training. CCPA is one of the first privacy regulations that explicitly calls out the need that if individuals in an organization touch, process, manage personal information, they require specific CCPA-related training. They need to know what their obligations are. They need to know what their responsibilities are. They need to know what individual customers, consumers, personnel may do to access and use that data. So it requires specific training. One of the parts to highlight in here is the breach-related component of the regulation. So again, there's I think 48 other state level and jurisdictional level breach notification regulations in the United States, last I checked. This is compounding California's existing breach notification regulation because it goes out and says that, hey, that act of breaching that information, that is now something that individuals can levy specific fines against you based on the breach of that information. So it kind of expanded California's law. As I mentioned before about fines, again, very explicit fines, but frankly, that's not the risk and the impact that our clients are seeing. Going back to the data subject rights or the individual rights mechanisms, or a person saying, do not sell my information, that requires cycles within your organization to be able to support those access requests. A person raising their hand and saying, give me all the information you have about me, that requires effort. That could require hundreds of hours of effort within an organization to be able to support those requests if the data is very unstructured. So that is a way for a person essentially to fine you without actually having to go to court and be overly litigious. It's just a case of they can make that request and it's going to burn hours of your personnel. The piece that I didn't highlight yet, just because I was holding back, is so far everything within this regulation has been focused on consumers. On January 1st, 2021, this regulation goes into effect for HR-related data. And that's explicitly where it's going to get very dangerous from that fines perspective. Because again, consumer data typically sits in very enterprise, very managed environments. HR-related data a lot of times does not. HR-related data sits in a lot of messaging platforms, it's performance data, it's hiring and termination related information, performance feedback. It sits in a lot of different systems in a lot of really unstructured ways. Individuals that are going to lodge individual rights requests around their HR data, that's going to require significant levels of effort in order to support. Last part I want to highlight in here is the deletion component. As mentioned before, a person can raise their hand and say, delete my information, and you have 45 days to do that. But again, most organizations can't delete data, so that's not typically what we're seeing. We're seeing people obfuscate data, so this way it can't be traced back. All right, next slide. So for those that are aware of the CCPA, I wanted to include a slide that just talks about the recent amendments. And again, this regulation is, being that they brought it forward so quickly, it's not well written. So there's a number of amendments that are coming out, and there's additional rulemaking coming out in the spring. But we're going to highlight these larger pieces. So the first part is personal information. As originally, it was written extremely broad. Anything about anybody is personal data. Now they've said if it's something that's reasonably capable of being tied to someone. So again, they include the reasonable nature. You don't have to link identities across all disparate environments and do some fuzzy logic. No, it needs to be reasonably capable. Moving down to these additional exemptions. So I mentioned before that January 1st, 2021 is when the exemptions are going to go in. I'm sorry, is when enforcement goes in for HR, but they've also clarified that B2B related relationships, business to business relationships, the data surround that is also delayed until January 1st, 2021. There's also a number of exemptions I talked about in here that I did not talk about regarding if you have to apply for GLBA, HIPAA, and now Fair Credit Reporting Act. So there are exemptions that if you have to collect and maintain data for those regulations, there's aspect of the CCPA that does not apply to you. I won't talk about the online only version because again, we're hotels, so you are not just giving people rooms online. There are these data broker registration components that again, that does not apply to you, but it's going to be individual companies that just collect data. All they do is collect data and sell data. They have no relationship with the consumer. There's specific activities they may now need to do. And the last part is on the breaches. So we're going to back before when talking about the penalties, they've clarified that if a person says, I'm just not sure if you've handled my data appropriately, that's not going to be a good reason to bring suit, or at least to impose a fine. If the data is breached, that's going to be a clear reason that a fine can be imposed. Next slide. I'm going to move through these real quick. As mentioned before, California is the first. California is not the last. So this was a version that we created in July, but we maintain a large inventory on our side. Last count, I think there's 37 different states that are coming up with similar legislation. So while California, I think, makes up 1/6 or 1/8 of the overall population of the United States, so a lot of companies said, okay, listen, we can limit this to California. Variants of CCPA are coming out all the time. Washington State has an interesting one right now that they actually say if I think it's the CEO knows that data is not being used appropriately and they're found guilty, they go to jail. So it's making people really care about this privacy thing. Next slide. So how can you tackle all these things? Again, this is my last slide I want to talk about. There's a lot of capabilities here. As mentioned before, individual rights, do not sell. When you provide consent from a minor, there's a lot of individual components to the CCPA that you have to abide by. At the same time, there's a lot of automation capabilities that are out there. So again, I didn't want to bake in every single component, but towards the bottom, there's a lot of individual automation mechanisms and domains that are considered. So if you're dealing with the regulation, you're dealing with maybe these other states, you're contemplating that, there's a lot of automation out there. So again, if you want to focus on, say, the privacy by design component, which is, okay, we need to make sure we understand how privacy related data is being used, collected, processed, built into systems, make sure we understand all of those things. Individual rights management, there are tools to help automate the front end to collect those requests, triage those requests, keep the information, keep the necessary records to be able to evidence to the regulators that you are doing these requests in a timely manner. There's a lot of pieces out there. So again, it's not a case of these regulation requires a tremendous amount of ad hoc manual processes. There are opportunities for automation. Next slide. I think that might be my last slide. Perfect. Johnny, I'm going to let you take it from here.
Thank you very much, Dan. I really appreciate it. Good day, everyone. Thank you for taking time to join us today. It's been an honor to be here to share my experience with you on this important but very complex topic. Next slide, please. This is a timeline that shows relevant cybersecurity law, the guidelines within the past few years. We're talking in the context of mainland China. From the left, the cybersecurity law, or the CSL, took effect in January 2017. And since then, it's been functioning as a foundational legislation for many cybersecurity standards and guidelines. It is intended to address rapid expansion of modern technologies, such as cloud computing, mobile apps, big data, AI, in addition to traditional computer system networks. Throughout the 2019 alone, multiple cybersecurity guidelines have been published and updated. For example, you will see there are several standards related to protecting personal information, or PI, here. On the right-hand side, 3 new laws are expected this year. One already came out, the cryptography law just took effect Jan 1 of this year. 2 in the blue text are coming out later this year, as you know, if everything goes as scheduled. The CPCS, also known as Multi-Level Protection Scheme, in the green text is the point of discussion today. The terms are being used interchangeably. CPCS is probably more current, in part due to the scope expansion in the revised guidelines. So the takeaway here, more cybersecurity standards and guidelines have come out pretty fast and intensely, and more are on the way. Next, please. Next slide. This provides a view of some of the key components of the CSL. Improving cybersecurity has been a key policy priority at the national level. In these 6 areas the CSLs try to address. In point 3, the network operators are referred to the cyberspace owners and managers, and also the cyberspace service providers. Point number 4, personal information covers basically customers or guests personally identify information, but it's a very broad definition, similar to the CCPA we just heard. Critical information infrastructure, or CII, in point 5, is a subject that's even more complex and subject to very different interpretation. But the hotel property management system, reward programs, airline reservation system, that will be pretty straightforward. That will be subject to this regulation here. Next slide, please. This provides a broad high-level view of some of the regulatory institutions that are involved in developing, publishing, monitoring, and enforcing cybersecurity standards and guidelines. From an operational standpoint, property owners, hotel managers, general counsels, and IT managers will be all kind of involved as a team. And folks on the ground will be most likely to interact with regulators at the city and local district level. For example, the 2 boxes, gray boxes at the end, they are involved in registering for your services and go through your certification processes. It will be helpful, I guess the takeaway is, it will be helpful for the company to identify a CPCS lead person to drive the effort. It'll be effective to do that across the border. Next slide, please. This provides a highlight. Yeah, thank you. This provides highlights of a CPCS requirements. CPCS 1.0 was initially published in 2008. The 2.0 calls for much stronger security protections over much broader system spectrum. It renews management and technical control requirements, and we'll talk a little bit more about details in the later slides. It was authorized and published by the 2 central government level agencies with input from a pretty long list of regulatory entities, state and private companies, academic institutions, and so forth. The enforcement arm here would be the city and local district PSBs, where a company's major facilities are located. For example, the company's regional headquarters or hotel sites. The 2.0 requires a company to go through a self-assessment to classify their cyber systems into one of the 5 protection levels based on the risk and impact, and implement proper security policy and procedures accordingly. Again, it applies to systems and the data that is involved in handling personal information system, that's equipment are located in China. And there are obviously a few other criteria are involved. Each application level would drive certain control measures, and we'll discuss later. Some of the noticeable changes from CPCS 1.0, obviously the definition has been extended. Some examples of hotel could be like hotel guest registration systems, airline reservation systems, some of the mobile apps, basically systems that handle guest information. And the equipment is our servers are sitting in China. The scope was consolidated somewhat, but included more detailed physical and environmental security, very detailed technical configurations, and third-party system vendor or service providers. So they are similar with Sarbanes-Oxley or GDPR, but bring a little more depth and breadth. Let's see. So there are repercussions involved across the monetary penalties, shutdown of company website in China, suspends business license in China, criminal penalties. So those are some of the examples of the penalties if they found you non-compliant. And the other noticeable changes is that in the past, their company can do a self-assessment, but the current trend is that the third-party assessment will be more kind of carry more weight, and we'll discuss it more later. Next slide, please. So CPCS lays out a control requirement for each of the 5 levels. The protection that should be corresponding to the degree or harm that may be caused to national security, economic development, or social life, should a harm or damage occur. The focus again is on the systems used to handle PI in mainland China and how they get transfers across the border. The sources of degree and harm are progressive, so are the control requirements. In the table here, the left column describes the source of harm. For example, a malicious attack on a hotel's online registration system, considering its origin, the magnitude, perhaps the level of intensity and sophistication of that attack. The middle column shows the impact of a harm or damage on these elements. The right column is where CPCS 2.0 expects the company to design and deploy their cybersecurity protections to be able to manage if and when attack on a system occur. Okay, as an example, if you look at a level 1, the first line here, system protection should be able to achieve recovery of partial system functions if and when it got hit by an individual with very limited resources that pose limited impact on some of these elements here. For example, a small scale data loss will be something considered as a minor or limited. From a protection capability standpoint, most systems at a hotel would likely to be at a level 2 and or level 3. There are other factors that go into these calculus here. So it is a pretty complex and sometimes pretty fluid process. So the company will have, it's to their advantage to go through the self-assessment first. There's a lot of factors going to the determination of a calculus in a system level. The exercise can be very tricky, and the company should probably start preparing for that soon. Next slide, please. This table shows you 10 control domains in the CPCS 2.0. Each domain describes a technical and management control requirements. There are probably 10 or to 12 sub areas in each of the domains. Each level of protection adds internal incremental control requirements to a lower level. So for example, a level 2 entity will probably subject to 130 plus control requirements. Level 3 entity will be over 200. And the difficulties and the rigor will increase as the level goes higher. The system graded at a level 3 and or above are required or expected to be technically maintained in mainland China and be inspected by a certification body, which is a third party quote unquote auditor at least once a year. The takeaway here is that the regulator, like a Public Security Bureau, would have a final say on the protection of the level determination, but the robust self-assessment done by the company is strategically important. It would be efficient that a company build a cross-border team to drive the program jointly. I also should mention that it'll be wise to, this is not just an IT effort. The general counsel, the CIO, the CISO, the chief risk officers would all be kind of actively participating, engaged. Next slide, please. This chart provides an operational view of the certification process and what companies may do to prepare for it. From the left to right, so the readiness self-assessment in step 1 or 2, the company needs to account for the systems that handles guest information, personal information, handles data transfer across the border that are in China. For example, you should be accounting for the names of systems, the servers, the descriptions of the functions and location of where those servers are, the nature of the guest data, storage location, volume, transfer frequency, the cross-border routing. So those are the information you should account for and consider that as part of your risk assessment. And you want to do a self-determination to develop an appropriate level of protection and make sure your cybersecurity policy and procedures are in place and operating effectively to meet those requirements. During the remediation process, step 3 and 4, the company should correct the gaps to a satisfactory degree. The idea is to save time and manpower on the back and forth during the third-party audit and increase the chance of getting a passing score sooner. Then you register with the PSB, which will trigger the external inspection for level 2 and above system environment. And during the third-party audit of step 5 or 6, company needs to be or expect to be cooperative. You need to be available to answer their questions and provide information that they're asking. It would be good to do a pre-work though internally to determine what documentation that should be made available, how you want to share them with the entities outside of your organization, because some of the technical information, for example, network diagrams, can be considered as sensitive information. This will, again, would require your consultation by the hotel managers or IT managers with your legal counsel upfront. And then for the filing and evaluation process, step 7 or 8, the CB will provide a listing of the security gaps they found during their assessment. Companies will typically get a couple of weeks' time to correct those issues before you go through your assessment. And then for step 9, 10, even though a cybersecurity program is not necessarily called for, but as you think about how you want to sustain that kind of exercise on a going forward basis, maybe more efficient to have that. So once everything is go as planned, the assessment is satisfactory, the PSB will provide the certificate to you. So one thing to note for system environment that's graded at level 3, you should be expecting like an annual assessment. For level 2, it will be once every other year. The key takeaway here is the certification process requires a lot of careful planning, coordination, communication across the border. A company should involve general counsel, CIO, CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, your risk officer, in addition to internal auditors, building managers, network engineers, and developers that are involved in those 10 domain areas. A CPCS lead at a higher level in the organization would be ideal. Next slide. This provides some impact or consideration as you contemplate your program, your effort for that process. This slide highlights potential impact on companies operating in China. The requirements are very complex, very fluid. Sometimes the guidelines are very vague and still being developed. So the process is very long and it can be costly. companies needs to take this seriously as well, and don't take a wait and see attitude. And in fact, some of the experience we had for companies who've been proactive actually can get some extra points, or at least build a good relationship with your external assessment bodies. From a strategic planning perspective, the CPCS is here to stay. Similar standards and guidelines are being rolled out and becoming more complex. Tougher inspections, monetary or non-monetary penalties, all could pose a potential disruption to business. Leaders from headquarters, Asia Pacific or China should collaborate on refreshing its strategy for growth aspirations, investment, and sustainable operations in China. On the budget front, there will be a fair amount of uncertainties and costs can add up quickly. So the certification assessment has its own cost. There are costs associated with contracting with third-party auditors and or additional support, for example, doing vulnerability scanning or a system penetration testing for level 2 or level 3 system environment. You probably should or would expect some equipment purchases, hiring people, deploying and train people in China would all bear some cost. Company needs to put a plan in place to help sort out where the budget should come from and how to handle emergency funding requests, who and how to keep track of spending. Obviously, going across the border can add more time and complexity to the process. Operationally, the CB will do their assessment on site, typically from a few days to a week. A lot of moving parts, and at least initially. So it all bears a impact on the normal day-to-day operations on the ground. So the company should devote enough time to execute a well thought out playbook to set the direction, provide guidelines with concrete steps throughout a certification life cycle. On the resource planning side, CPCS is ramping up across all industries. The travel and hotel business is actually a top target. So it's a race to get to the right people as soon as possible. For level 2, for some level 2 environment, level 3 environment, there is an expectation for localization, which means company needs to recruit people, onboard and train people, deploy people in China, and manage the program in China. So people with technical expertise, program management skills, language and cultural awareness are often important attributes for success. So the takeaway here is the company needs to begin preparing for it now. So I think this is my last slide, and quick recap in terms of some of the suggested action items. So take this information back to your organization, have conversation with general counsel, your CIO, your CISO, and CIO, right, to get the strategic guidelines and guidance, and appoint someone to start preparation, involving folks from US and China. Consider how and where that you can save. Their organization have internal programs in place already. I would imagine internal audits, GDPR, SOX. So see where we can leverage and save, and do additional research, and I'll contact Dan and myself if you have additional questions. Thank you.
That's great, Johnny, and thank you, Dan. I think, Lauren, we're probably at a point now where if we have any questions, we can certainly try our best to answer them. And I know that we've already had 1 or 2 that have come through the Q&A chat box as well. So Lauren, do we hand to you to get questions here?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Guy, and thanks to Dan and Johnny for all this information. I know a lot for our members to think about and to start implementing in their day-to-day practices in a lot of different scenarios. One question that came in, what are some of the challenges in preparing for and implementing the CPCS for a multinational company? Johnny, I know you touched on that a little bit, but if you could maybe expand a little bit, knowing that many of our members have an international footprint.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. So what we see, the trend is that the pace has picked up quite significantly. Obviously, this virus thing probably will cause some pause, but if you look at before that, there's quite a bit of pace picked up. For example, the PSBs have been going to tier 1 cities in the past, like Beijing and Shanghai. Now they're actually going to other tier 1 cities and tier 2 cities. So the scale has kind of expanded, right? And then because of the new, how recent this whole thing comes out and the vagueness or the lack of specific guidelines, the challenge is how do you put the resources to develop a strategic and a specific plan of attack. So when you consider, like in the hotel environment, if you are in multiple locations, so how do you create standardization, documentation sharing? Some of the things I mentioned, that policy procedure that may be applicable in the US may not be totally applicable in China, right? And then the PSBs and the regulators generally, they will expect to see something that are more relevant or applicable to their environment. So there will be customization or updates or revision being made to your corporate policies. So the localization is something unique to this environment, where company needs to provide some additional thoughts around how to deal with that. The other thing is on the people side, because everybody started gearing for this exercise. So finding the right people and get them trained on about what to expect during a certification process at every stages will be useful, so that you will get the best kind of message out for your company. So from a process perspective and people perspective, the challenge around internal coordination, consultation, and then be able to manage the third party interactions.
Great, thank you. And then a couple questions coming in around enforcement and what that might look like by the July 1st deadline date of compliance, and whether there's penalties imposed if you're not 100% in compliance. So Dan, maybe you could speak a little bit to that time frame.
Yeah, so yeah, that's right. I mean, the enforcement date's not going to happen until July. California AG, I want to say it was back in November, October timeframe, when they did their essentially their kind of the State of the Union, and explained where they saw the regulation going and what to be expected from the amendments. They highlighted specifically that, yeah, while we're not enforcing until July 1st, if you are found to be not in compliance from something identified on February 15th, we're still going to hold you to it. I think the actual metaphor they use, which I'm going to butcher, was like, yeah, if you murder someone before there was an effective date, like you still murdered someone, you still did something lawful. So they are still keeping track of that. So if there was some identified non-compliance, like say, for instance, if there was a breach and there was material impact on California residents, and that happened today, for instance, yeah, that would be one of those cases where enforcement could be taken, and the California AG could take action on July 1st.
Got it, thanks. And are you guys starting to see things with other states in terms of planning outside of California and or other potential hot button issues that they might be focused in on?
Yeah, the short summary is yes. So, so many other states are looking at other legislation. As I mentioned before, Washington State, they're saying, okay, the CEO goes to jail. So there are other states that are coming up with some unique pieces. What we're seeing as far as trends is it seems like a lot of states are coming up with some aspect of CCPA. So we're seeing other states coming up with, say, do not sell my information. So they're coming up with variations of that, or they're coming up with variations of, hey, give me access to my data. So those core components of CCPA seem to be getting replicated in other states. We right now maintain a kind of rolling inventory of all these draft legislations and where they are in committee. and everything, just because we have to be aware of where things are going. But yeah, stuff is absolutely going to be rolling through over the next several months. I wouldn't be surprised if something pops up in the next 2 weeks from like New York or California. That's the other part, is California is also talking about expanding the CCPA. So again, they may be amending their own act.
Okay, and another question came in. Do you think there's going to be any trends, or are you all starting to see trends regarding the enforcement element of the compliance?
We are seeing a lot of, say, the individual do not sell activity. We're seeing a lot of give me access to my data, the individual rights requests. We're seeing a pretty significant uptick. One of my consumer products companies that I'm actually on site with right now taking this call, they've received just under 800 requests so far this calendar year. So they're talking 5 weeks in, they've already received about 800. And when it pivots over to the HR component in January of 2021, it's going to be rough. You know, we did learn a lot from GDPR when they were supporting HR-related requests for data subject rights requests. It's going to be bad when HR happens, because, for instance, the data you collected on a person you did not hire, and that feedback, I said, yeah, I feel like this person just wouldn't line up with our people, or I think this person was dumb. Any comments like that, those are all things that would be turned over in the individual rights request from an HR component. So we're definitely seeing a lot of action, and I don't think that action is going to be going away. I think there's probably going to be another spike in January when the enforcement officially starts as well.
Yeah, from a CPCS perspective, we've seen the regulator going around the say hotel properties. You know, oftentimes they're announced, right? They're coming on site. They will be asking for your security, policies, procedures, asking you how to handle security incidents. If you find those answers not satisfactory, they will issue you warning letters, or they will call you into to say, well, I'll give you a month to get yourself organized, and then they will follow up. So there are certainly that kind of activities that will be booming up. There's not necessarily a specific date or rhythm. People can figure out there's a wide variety of variation across cities, but generally speaking, that seems to be what's going to be taking more and more in terms of frequency and scale. So part of that is to make it harder for people to prepare for CPCS. But I think the way to do it is probably not look at this just as a compliance exercise. Consider this as part of your normal business operations. Be prepared, be organized, and be ready to provide a solid response at moment's notice.
Great. Well, thank you all. I don't see any other questions that have come in at this time, but for the members that are on the line, certainly if you think of others after today's presentation, please feel free to reach out to an HNLA staff member, and we could certainly link you up with the appropriate contact at Deloitte. So just a special thanks to Guy, Johnny, and Dan for taking time today to present, and for Deloitte's support of HNLA and our industry and all that you all do to provide the necessary resources and critical information like this to our members. We certainly appreciate it. Thanks to everyone who joined us for today's presentation. We hope you found the information valuable, and just a reminder that a recording will be available in our archive in the coming days. Hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.